At 60, I finally understand life, and before you decide whether to stay or leave, let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever felt tired even when nothing was technically wrong? Because that quiet tiredness is what brought you here. Today, my name is Nova. I am 60 years old, and this is not a motivational talk or a lesson from a book. This is my life, shared exactly as it was lived, with confusion, silence, effort, and late understanding. And if these first few seconds already feel familiar, then stay with me, because this story may not change your life instantly, but it may change the way you look at it. And before we go further, if stories like this help you reflect, please like this video and subscribe to Wisdom After Regret, because this channel exists for people who are thinking deeply about life, not just scrolling through it. And now let me take you back, because understanding did not come to me early. It came slowly, painfully, and quietly. When I was young, I believed life was something you earn by being good, by being useful, by being quiet. I believed if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, and sacrificed enough, life would eventually reward me with peace. So I became that woman, the dependable one, the one who always adjusted, the one who said yes even when her heart said no. And at the time, it felt like maturity. It felt like responsibility. But now I understand it was fear wearing the mask of goodness, fear of disappointing others, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as difficult. And years passed like this, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, days turning into months, months into years, and on the outside my life looked fine, but inside something felt missing, like I was living someone else's version of a good life. And I remember moments when I would sit alone at night, exhausted but unable to sleep, asking myself questions I didn't have the courage to answer. Is this really me? Is this what I wanted? And instead of listening, I distracted myself. I stayed busy because business is a very convenient way to avoid honesty, and at 60 I finally understand that staying busy does not mean staying alive. And back then I thought understanding would come automatically with age, that one day I would just wake up wise, but wisdom does not arrive unless you are willing to look at your mistakes without excuses. And my first real awakening came when nothing dramatic happened, no accident, no tragedy, just a quiet realization that time was moving faster than my courage. And that scared me, because I had spent so long preparing for a future that never arrived, always telling myself later, later I will rest, later I will choose myself, later I will speak my truth. But later is a story we tell ourselves to avoid discomfort now. And life allows that for a while, but not forever. And I noticed my body changing before my mindset did. Constant tiredness, a heaviness in my chest, a lack of joy even in moments that were supposed to make me happy. And this is something I want you to hear clearly. Your body never lies. It remembers every boundary you ignore, every emotion you swallow, every truth you delay. And when I finally listened, I realized I had spent decades trying to be accepted instead of trying to be authentic. And authenticity feels risky when you are used to approval, because approval comes from others. But authenticity requires self-trust, something I had never built. And this is where my regrets began, not with big mistakes, but with small silences repeated for years. And if you are listening and thinking this sounds like you, know this: awareness means you are already changing. And as I share this story on Wisdom After Regret, my intention is not to tell you what to do, but to show you what happens when you wait too long to listen to yourself. Because what I learned next about love, sacrifice, and identity completely changed how I see life. And that is where this story continues. As I moved deeper into my 40s and then my 50s, the truth I had been avoiding started appearing everywhere, not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently, in the way certain conversations drained me, in the way I felt invisible even when I was surrounded by people, and in the way my own voice sounded unfamiliar to me. And at 60, I finally understand that when you ignore yourself for too long, you eventually forget who you are. And that forgetting is far more dangerous than failure, because failure still means you tried, but forgetting yourself means you stopped asking who you were living for. And I remember how often I told myself that this was just how life was, that everyone was tired, that everyone compromised, that this was adulthood. But that was another lie I used to stay comfortable, because comfort felt safer than change. And change required courage I didn't believe I had. And one of the most painful realizations for me was understanding how often I confused being needed with being loved. Because when people needed me, I felt valuable. And when they didn't, I felt lost. And at 60, I can say clearly, being needed is not the same as being cherished. Because need can disappear the moment you stop giving. But genuine connection remains even when you rest. And this misunderstanding shaped many of my relationships. I stayed longer than I should have. I gave more than I could afford emotionally. And I accepted less than I deserved, all because I believed that endurance was proof of love. But endurance without reciprocity slowly turns into resentment. And resentment, when unspoken, turns inward, becoming sadness, self-doubt, and eventually exhaustion. And my exhaustion was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. And there were days when I felt guilty for feeling unhappy, because my life looked fine from the outside, and that guilt kept me silent, because complaining felt ungrateful. And at 60, I finally understand that gratitude and honesty can coexist. You can appreciate what you have and still acknowledge what hurts. And denying pain does not make you strong, it makes you disconnected. And this disconnection showed up in subtle ways. I stopped dreaming boldly. I stopped imagining different possibilities, and I started measuring my worth by how useful I was to others, and usefulness became my identity. And when usefulness is your identity, rest feels like failure, saying no feels selfish, and choosing yourself feels wrong. And I lived like that for years, telling myself I was doing the right thing until my body and mind quietly disagreed. And one evening I remember sitting alone after everyone else was asleep, feeling an overwhelming sadness without a clear reason. And in that moment I realized I had spent so much time being strong for others that I never allowed myself to be honest with myself. And that moment didn't break me, it cracked me open, because once the crack appears, light has a way in. And slowly I began questioning the stories I had been telling myself, stories like if I don't hold everything together, it will all fall apart. If I speak up, I will be rejected. If I change, I will lose people. And some of those fears came true. Some people didn't like the version of me that started setting boundaries. Some relationships shifted, some faded. But something else happened too. I felt lighter, calmer, and more present. And I learned that the right people don't leave when you become honest. They leave when you stop pretending. And another truth I finally understand is that time does not reward patience if patience is just fear in disguise, because I waited for the right moment to live authentically. But the right moment never arrives. There is only the moment you decide to stop postponing yourself. And I also learned that comparison is a quiet thief. I spent years comparing my life to others, their achievements, their happiness, their timelines, without realizing that everyone edits their story. And when you compare your real life to someone else's highlights, you will always feel behind. But life is not a race. It is a personal journey, and once I stopped racing, I started noticing. Noticing small joys, quiet mornings, honest conversations, and moments of peace that were always there but overshadowed by pressure. And through all of this, forgiveness slowly entered my life. Not forgiveness for others first, but forgiveness for myself. Forgiving myself for not knowing what I know now, for making choices out of fear rather than courage. Because forgiveness is not weakness, it is release, and release creates space. And in that space, understanding grows. And this is why I continue sharing these reflections on wisdom after regret. Because regret does not mean you failed, it means you learned, and learning, even late, still changes the future. And as I reached my late 50s, these lessons began reshaping how I viewed love, success, aging, and purpose. And yet, the hardest realization was still ahead of me, the one about regret itself, and what regret truly represents. And that is where my story moves next. As I entered my late 50s, regret became a silent companion that followed me everywhere. Not because I had done terrible things, but because I had ignored my own voice for far too long. And at 60, I finally understand that the deepest regrets are not about mistakes you made, but about chances you never took, words you never spoke, and moments you never allowed yourself to feel. And I remember sitting one evening looking at old photographs, seeing faces and places that meant something once, and realizing how often I had chosen safety over authenticity, how often I had said yes when my heart screamed no, and I had done it out of fear of losing people, fear of disappointing others, fear of change, fear of failure. And I see now how exhausting it was to live in a body that obeyed rules it had never agreed to, how the energy I spent keeping appearances could have been used to create joy. And for years I believed that endurance was the measure of strength, that sacrificing for others proved worth. But endurance without joy is just a slow erosion of self. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began noticing the signs my mind and body had been giving me for decades: the tiredness, the restless nights, the heaviness in my chest, the quiet dissatisfaction that had no name until I learned to listen. And listening was terrifying, because it meant confronting truths I had buried under politeness, under duty, under habit. And I remember a particular moment, sitting in the quiet of my living room, feeling the weight of all the words I never said, the apologies I never gave, the boundaries I never set, and I realized that life does not wait for you to feel ready, and neither do the consequences of postponing your own needs. And in that realization, I started making small, deliberate choices, learning to say no without guilt, to rest without shame, to prioritize honesty over comfort. And every small act felt revolutionary, because I had spent so long believing my needs were secondary, invisible, or unworthy. And this is something I want everyone listening to understand. There is no shame in choosing yourself. There is no failure in protecting your energy, in living truthfully. And as I embraced this, the clarity deepened, showing me that love, real love, does not demand self-erasure, and relationships that require you to disappear are not sustainable. They are draining, and learning to release them is painful, but freedom is worth the pain. And another hard lesson was understanding that time is unforgiving. It does not pause for comfort. It does not slow for hesitation, and I had waited too long for perfect conditions to speak, to act, to choose. And what I finally learned is that there is no perfect moment. There is only the courage to begin where you are. And when I stopped waiting, I felt alive again in ways I had forgotten were possible, noticing small joys, real laughter, quiet mornings, simple conversations, and I understood that comparison had stolen decades of peace from me, because I had measured my life against edited versions of others' lives. And the moment I stopped doing that, the world became softer, and learning to forgive myself was one of the hardest and most liberating acts. forgiving myself for naivety, for fear, for tolerating too much, for ignoring intuition, because self-forgiveness allows forward motion, and forward motion creates opportunities for wisdom, and wisdom, I finally see, does not come with age automatically. It comes with awareness, attention, and courage to face oneself honestly. And in sharing this on wisdom after regret, my intention is not to impress, but to offer a mirror, a chance to reflect, to consider, perhaps to recognize parts of yourself you have been avoiding. And as I approach 60, these realizations have reshaped my view of life, love, relationships, and priorities. I see now that youth has energy, but age has clarity, and clarity allows us to discern what truly matters. And if you are listening carefully, understand this. It is never too late to realign your life, to set boundaries, to honor yourself. Because the moment you start, momentum builds, and one small step leads to another, and eventually you notice that the life you feared losing is not lost, it is being rebuilt, carefully, intentionally, authentically. And as I close this part of my journey, I urge you to comment on what resonates with you, to share this story with someone who might need permission to pause, to reflect, to choose themselves, because stories heal when they are shared. And this reflection, this intimate recount of my life, is meant to offer clarity, courage, and hope. And as I move into 60, I finally see the beauty in understanding life not through perfection, but through awareness, presence, honesty, and the lessons that only come when you listen deeply. And this realization, this deep understanding, is the reason I continue sharing my story on wisdom after regret. Because life is fleeting, and clarity, no matter how late, is invaluable. And that is where my story prepares to reach its conclusion in the next part. As I finally stand at 60, I can see the threads of my life weaving together in a way I never noticed before. The years of confusion, the years of silence, the years of trying to please others at my own expense, all now forming a picture that makes sense. And at this point, I understand that life was never asking me to be perfect. It was asking me to be present, to notice, to choose, and to forgive. And for decades, I had mistaken endurance for strength, sacrifice for love, and conformity for safety. And now I see clearly that true strength comes from authenticity. True love allows space for your own growth. And true safety is felt in alignment with your own truth. And I want everyone listening to understand that it is never too late to start noticing yourself, to listen to the quiet nudges, to honor your feelings, and to stop postponing your own life. Because the moment you start, change begins. And it is not dramatic, it is subtle, it is a shift in perception, a choice to speak up, a choice to rest, a choice to love yourself first. And in doing this, I have seen the world change around me, not because the world changed, but because I changed, because my energy changed, my awareness shifted, and people either adjusted or moved away. And the ones who stayed were the ones who mattered, because they connected with the real me, not the version I pretended to be. And this is why I continue sharing my story on wisdom after regret, because if one person watching this chooses honesty, chooses presence, chooses themselves, then everything I went through has meaning. And if you are listening and it resonates, please leave a comment below. Tell me what part of my journey touched you the most. And share this story with someone who may need to hear permission to slow down, to reflect, to honor themselves, because stories heal when shared. And as I reflect on my life from 60, I realize that regret is not a curse but a guide, not a burden but a reminder, that every time we postpone ourselves, we lose a little, but every time we listen, we gain clarity, freedom, and peace. And now I am free enough to say that understanding life is not about answers. It is about questions questions we are brave enough to face, questions that make us notice where we have been, how far we have come, and where we can go. And for anyone watching, know this: you are not too late. You are learning, and learning is the most beautiful part of living. And as I close this chapter, I am grateful for every mistake, every hesitation, every fear, because they brought me here, to this clarity. And if this story inspires even a single pause, a single reflection, a single act of courage, then it has fulfilled its purpose. And I encourage you again to comment, share, and engage, because our lives are better when we connect. And finally, as I sit quietly and look back on 60 years, I can say with peace, with understanding, and with hope that life is not about perfection. It is about presence, authenticity, love, forgiveness, and choosing yourself. And this truly is where my story ends.